The morning sun cast long shadows across the Colorado Territory as Ezra Thornfield approached the massive railroad bridge construction site. His weathered boots crunched against the rocky ground while he surveyed the ambitious project before him. The canyon stretched nearly 200 feet across, its depths disappearing into morning mist that clung to the stone walls like forgotten promises. Ezra carried his worn leather tool satchel, the same one that had accompanied him through 4 decades of building bridges, railroads, and mining infrastructure across the western frontier. His clothes bore the honest patches of a working man, his flannel shirt faded from countless washings, his canvas pants reinforced at the knees where years of kneeling over blueprints had worn the fabric thin. At 67, his face showed every year spent under harsh suns and bitter winds. Deep lines etched around pale blue eyes that had witnessed more construction miracles than most men could imagine. His silver beard, neatly trimmed despite his rough appearance, framed a mouth that rarely wasted words. Calloused hands, scarred from decades of rope burns and metal cuts, gripped the satchel with the steady confidence of a master craftsman. The work crew had already assembled near the massive timber framework that would support the bridge construction. 6 young men in their 20s and 30s clustered around their foreman, their voices carrying across the canyon with the easy confidence of those who had never faced a challenge they could not overcome through brute strength and youthful energy. Marcus Steele commanded attention even from a distance. 28 years old with the broad shoulders of a man who had spent his adult life swinging hammers and hauling timber. He stood nearly 6 feet tall with the kind of presence that made other men step back when he entered a room. His clean work shirt and new leather boots marked him as someone who had risen quickly through the ranks, his success built more on ambition than experience. Dark eyes held the hard glint of a man who had learned to take what he wanted through force of personality and the backing of his crew. Ezra descended the rocky slope toward the work site, his movements careful but sure-footed. The younger men noticed his approach first, their conversations gradually dying as they took in his weathered appearance and obvious age. By the time he reached the edge of their gathering, 6 pairs of eyes were studying him with barely concealed amusement. Marcus turned from the blueprint table where he had been explaining the day's work assignments. His gaze traveled from Ezra's patched boots to his gray hair, a slow smile spreading across his face that held no warmth. "Well now," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. "What do we have here, boys? Looks like someone's grandfather got lost on his way to the general store." Laughter rippled through the crew, the sound sharp and cruel in the morning stillness. Tom Bradley, a red-headed giant with arms like tree trunks, stepped forward with an exaggerated bow. "Maybe he's looking for his rocking chair, boss." More laughter followed, each chuckle driving deeper into the canyon of disrespect that had opened between the young men and the old. Ezra stood quietly, his pale eyes moving from face to face, taking the measure of each man with the patience of someone who had learned that first impressions often proved wildly inaccurate. "I'm here about the bridge work," Ezra said simply. His voice carried the gravelly tone of a man who had spent years calling instructions over the noise of construction sites, low but with an underlying strength that seemed to surprise the younger men. Marcus exchanged glances with his crew before turning back to Ezra with theatrical interest. "Bridge work," he repeated slowly. "Well, I'll be damned. And what exactly makes you think you're qualified for bridge work, old-timer?" Ezra reached into his satchel and withdrew a folder of papers, their edges worn soft from handling. 40 years building bridges, railroads, and mining infrastructure," he said, offering the documents. "From the Mississippi to California. Got references from railroad companies in 12 states. Marcus took the folder but did not open it. Instead, he held it up for his crew to see, his expression one of mock consideration. 40 years, he announced. "Boys, we got ourselves a genuine antique here. Probably built bridges back when they used wooden wheels and oxen." The laughter grew louder now, feeding on itself as each man tried to top the previous joke. Jake Morrison, lean and quick with the nervous energy of youth, called out that maybe Ezra had built the first bridge right here in the Garden of Eden. Sam Patterson, whose massive frame made even Marcus look small, suggested they ask him about the good old days when bridges were held up with thoughts and prayers. Ezra waited through the performance with the stillness of stone. His hands remained steady at his sides, his breathing even and controlled. Only his eyes moved, cataloging each face, measuring each man's character in the space of heartbeats. Marcus finally opened the folder, his eyes scanning the references with growing incredulity. Letters from railroad presidents, mine owners, and territorial governors praised Ezra's innovative techniques and problem-solving abilities. Testimonials detailed bridges that had stood for decades in impossible conditions, structures that had saved companies millions of dollars and countless lives. But Marcus saw only the opportunity to cement his authority in front of his crew. He snapped the folder shut and handed it back with a dismissive gesture. Very impressive, Grandpa. I'm sure these were all wonderful accomplishments back in the Stone Age. But this is 1885, and we need men who can swing a hammer without breaking their backs doing it. The crew erupted in approval, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. Marcus basked in their attention like a man standing before a warm fire, his chest swelling with the pride of leadership. We got ourselves a crew of strong young backs and smart heads, Marcus continued, gesturing toward his men. We don't need some broken-down relic telling us how they did things when Lincoln was president. This job calls for men in their prime, not museum pieces. Ezra folded the references back into his satchel with movements that betrayed no emotion. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the full scope of the canyon that would challenge any bridge builder. 200 feet across, 150 feet deep, with wind patterns that could turn a simple construction project into a death trap for inexperienced crews. I see, Ezra said finally. His voice remained level, but something in the tone made Tom Bradley stop laughing mid-chuckle. And how long do you figure this project will take? Marcus straightened, sensing challenge in the question. 2 weeks, he announced proudly. Railroad company wanted a month, but I told them my boys could do it in half the time. We start the foundation framework today and have the whole support system completed ahead of schedule. Ezra nodded slowly, his pale eyes moving from the blueprint table to the canyon walls, calculating angles and stress points with the automatic precision of decades spent solving engineering puzzles. 2 weeks, he repeated, for the entire support framework. That's right, old man. Marcus stepped closer, using his height advantage to loom over Ezra. While you were probably sitting on your porch whittling, me and my crew have been revolutionizing construction timelines. We work fast, we work smart, and we get results. The crew murmured agreement, their confidence absolute in their leader and themselves. They had tackled projects across 3 territories, earning reputations as the fastest crew in the railroad business. Youth and strength had never failed them, and they saw no reason to doubt themselves now. Ezra studied Marcus for a long moment, taking in the man's posture, the set of his shoulders, the way his hands rested on his hips with casual arrogance. Then his gaze shifted to the crew, noting how they clustered behind their leader like pack animals seeking protection from an alpha. Well then, Ezra said quietly, I suppose you boys know your business. He touched the brim of his worn hat in a gesture that might have been respect or farewell. Good luck with your bridge. He turned and walked away, his stride unhurried despite the humiliation he had just endured. Behind him, Marcus called out a final insult about old dogs and new tricks, his crew's laughter following Ezra up the rocky slope like a pack of coyotes celebrating their dominance. But as Ezra climbed toward the ridge overlooking the work site, his movements carried none of the defeated shuffle that Marcus expected. His back remained straight, his steps sure, and his pale eyes had taken on the sharp focus of a man who was no longer seeking employment but conducting reconnaissance. From his position on the ridge, Ezra had a perfect view of the entire construction site. He settled onto a flat boulder and opened his satchel again, this time withdrawing a small telescope and a leather-bound notebook. For the next hour, he watched Marcus and his crew begin their work, his experienced eye cataloging every decision, every technique, every shortcut that the young men employed in their eagerness to prove their superiority. Down in the canyon, townspeople had begun to gather at a respectful distance from the work site. Word had spread quickly through the nearby settlement that construction had begun on the railroad bridge that would connect their community to the wider world. Children pointed excitedly at the massive timber framework while their parents discussed the economic opportunities that the railroad would bring. Among the observers, Clara Henley stood apart from the crowd. A widow in her 50s whose husband had died in a mining accident 2 years earlier, she ran a small boarding house that catered to traveling workers and railroad men. Her sharp eyes had noticed the old man's arrival and the crew's cruel reception, and something about the stranger's dignity in the face of humiliation had caught her attention. Clara had seen enough construction workers pass through her boarding house to recognize the difference between genuine skill and youthful bluster. The way the old man had studied the canyon, the careful precision of his movements, the quality of his tools despite their age, all suggested a level of expertise that Marcus and his crew had been too arrogant to recognize. As the afternoon wore on and Ezra remained on his rocky perch, taking notes and making calculations, Clara found herself climbing the slope toward his position. She carried a tin cup of coffee and a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth, the kind of practical kindness that had sustained frontier communities for generations. Ezra looked up from his notebook as she approached, his pale eyes holding a wariness that spoke of too many years dealing with people who wanted something from him. "Thought you might be thirsty," Clara said simply, offering the coffee. "It's a long climb up here in this sun." Ezra accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, his weathered hands steady as he sipped the strong brew. The coffee was good, hot and bitter in the way that working men preferred. "Name's Clara Henley," she said, settling onto a nearby rock. "I run the boarding house down in town. Been watching those boys work all morning." "Ezra Thornfield," he replied. "And I appreciate the coffee, Mrs. Henley." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, both watching the activity below. Marcus had his crew attacking the foundation work with impressive energy but questionable technique. They were strong and willing, but their approach lacked the methodical precision that complex engineering required. "My late husband used to talk about bridge builders," Clara said eventually. "Said there was one fellow, went by iron something. Built bridges that never fell, even in the worst conditions. Always wondered what happened to men like that." Ezra's hands stilled on the coffee cup, but his expression remained neutral. "Time moves on," he said simply. "Old ways get replaced by new methods." Clara studied his profile, noting the way his eyes tracked every movement of the crew below, the unconscious way his hands moved, as if calculating stress loads and weight distributions. "Maybe," she said softly, "but my husband always said there was no substitute for experience when lives were on the line." Ezra finished the coffee and handed back the cup. "Thank you kindly for the refreshment, Mrs. Henley. It was generous of you." As Clara made her way back down the slope, Ezra returned to his notebook. The afternoon sun revealed details that morning shadows had hidden, and what he saw made his experienced eye narrow with concern. Marcus and his crew were making decisions based on speed rather than safety, cutting corners that would create dangerous weaknesses in the bridge's foundation. By evening, when the crew finally called an end to their first day's work, Ezra had filled 12 pages with detailed observations. He had identified 17 separate violations of basic engineering principles, 11 safety hazards that could prove fatal, and 3 critical structural errors that would guarantee the bridge's eventual collapse. As darkness settled over the canyon and the work crew headed into town to celebrate their productive first day, Ezra remained on his rocky perch. The stars emerged one by one in the clear mountain sky, and still he sat motionless, his mind working through calculations and possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. The question was not whether Marcus and his crew would fail, but how many lives would be at risk when they did. And despite the humiliation of this morning's rejection, Ezra Thornfield had never walked away from a bridge that needed building or lives that needed saving. The old engineer finally packed his tools and made his way down the slope toward town, his movements sure-footed even in the darkness. Behind him, the incomplete bridge framework stood silhouetted against the stars, waiting for morning to reveal whether youth and arrogance or experience and wisdom would ultimately span the canyon. Dawn broke over the canyon with the kind of crystalline clarity that made every detail sharp and unforgiving. Marcus Steele arrived at the work site before his crew, his stride confident as he surveyed the foundation work they had begun the previous day. The massive timber framework rose from the canyon floor like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast, impressive in its ambition if not its execution. By the time his 6 men gathered around the blueprint table, Marcus had already identified 3 areas where they could accelerate their timeline. Speed had become his obsession, the metric by which he measured his worth as a foreman. Every day they finished ahead of schedule was another victory over the old-fashioned methods that had slowed progress for too long. Tom Bradley arrived first, his red hair catching the morning light as he examined the foundation posts they had set yesterday. The massive man possessed the kind of raw strength that could drive railroad spikes with a dozen hammer blows, but his enthusiasm often outpaced his understanding of structural engineering principles. "Looking good, boss," Tom announced, slapping one of the support beams with a meaty hand. "These babies aren't going anywhere." Jake Morrison and Sam Patterson arrived together, their voices carrying across the canyon as they discussed their plans to impress the railroad executives who would inspect the work next week. Both men had built their reputations on projects that prioritized impressive visual progress over methodical technical precision, and neither saw a reason to change their approach now. Marcus gathered his crew around the blueprint table, spreading the engineering drawings across the scarred wooden surface. The plan showed a complex network of support structures, cross braces, and foundation anchors that would distribute the bridge's weight across the canyon walls with mathematical precision. "All right, boys," Marcus began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Yesterday was just warm-up. Today we show these railroad boys how real men build bridges. I want those foundation anchors set and the first cross braces installed before noon." The crew responded with the enthusiasm of young men who had never encountered a challenge they could not overcome through sheer force of will. They attacked their assigned tasks with impressive energy, their hammers ringing against iron spikes in a rhythm that echoed off the canyon walls like some primitive war drum. But energy was not the same as expertise, and impressive sounds did not guarantee structural integrity. From his position on the ridge above, Ezra Thornfield watched the morning's work with the practiced eye of someone who had seen enthusiasm create more disasters than solutions. Through his small telescope, Ezra observed Marcus directing his crew to install foundation anchors at intervals that violated basic engineering principles. The spacing was wrong, the angles incorrect, and the depth insufficient for the loads they would eventually bear. Each mistake compounded the others, creating a cascade of structural weaknesses that would prove catastrophic under stress. Ezra opened his leather-bound notebook and began recording specific violations with the methodical precision that had made him legendary among railroad engineers. Anchor point 7 installed at 42 degrees instead of required 35. Cross brace mounting height varied by 6 inches between identical spans. Foundation depth averaged 18 inches below minimum specification. The morning sun climbed higher, revealing details that confirmed Ezra's growing concern. Marcus and his crew were building an impressive-looking structure that would collapse under the first heavy load. Their confidence was absolute, but their technique was fundamentally flawed. Around midday, Clara Henley appeared on the ridge carrying a basket covered with checkered cloth. Her climb up the rocky slope showed the determined pace of someone who had made this journey before, and Ezra looked up from his notebook with something approaching a smile. "Thought you might be hungry," Clara said, settling beside him on the flat boulder that had become his observation post. "Brought some beef stew and fresh bread. A man can't live on determination alone." Ezra accepted the meal gratefully, his weathered hands steady as he spooned the rich stew from the tin bowl. Clara had clearly spent time in kitchens that fed working men, because the portions were generous and the seasoning perfect for someone who had been sitting in mountain air since dawn. "They've been at it all morning," Clara observed, nodding toward the work site below, "making a powerful lot of noise for men who only started yesterday." Ezra chewed thoughtfully before responding. "Noise isn't always progress," he said simply. "Sometimes it just means you're working harder instead of smarter." Clara studied his profile, noting the way his eyes tracked every movement of the crew below. "My late husband used to tell stories about bridge builders," she said casually. "Said there was one fellow who was so good at his trade that other engineers would travel hundreds of miles just to watch him work. Called him Iron Ezra on account of how his bridges never failed, no matter what the weather or the terrain threw at them." Ezra's hands paused for just a moment before continuing with his meal. "Iron Ezra," he repeated. "Can't say I've heard that name in a while." Clara's voice dropped to a more confidential tone. "My husband said this Iron Ezra fellow had a way of looking at a construction site, and seeing problems that wouldn't show up for months. Said he once predicted a bridge collapse 3 weeks before it happened, but the railroad bosses wouldn't listen on account of him being too old-fashioned in his methods. The resemblance between the story and Ezra's current situation was not lost on either of them. Below in the canyon, Marcus was directing his crew to install cross braces that would create dangerous stress concentrations at exactly the points Ezra had identified as problematic. Stories like that have a way of growing in the telling, Ezra said diplomatically. But I've known engineers who could read a construction site like other men read newspapers. Takes experience to see the patterns. Clara packed up the empty dishes with efficient movements, but her eyes remained thoughtful. Experience, she agreed. My husband always said there was no substitute for it when lives were hanging in the balance. After Clara departed, Ezra returned to his observations with renewed focus. The afternoon brought new mistakes as Marcus pushed his crew to maintain their accelerated timeline. Foundation measurements that should have been double-checked were accepted on first reading. Support beam placements that required careful calculation were estimated by eye. Quality control procedures that would have caught dangerous errors were skipped in favor of speed. By evening, when the crew gathered their tools and headed into town, Ezra had documented enough structural violations to justify shutting down the entire project. But he was no longer employed by the railroad company, and his warnings had already been rejected with cruel mockery. The Golden Nugget Saloon buzzed with conversation as Marcus and his crew celebrated another productive day. Word of their impressive progress had spread through town, and local citizens bought them drinks while praising their efficiency and skill. The attention fed Marcus's ego like whiskey fed his confidence. Tom Bradley regaled the crowd with exaggerated stories of their engineering prowess, his massive frame dominating the bar as he demonstrated hammer techniques with theatrical flair. Jake Morrison and Sam Patterson held court at a corner table, explaining to fascinated townspeople how modern construction methods were revolutionizing bridge building. But it was Marcus who commanded the room's attention when he stood to address the gathering. "Brothers," he announced, his voice carrying easily over the saloon's din, "we're making history out there. That bridge is going up faster and stronger than anything the railroad boys have ever seen." Applause erupted from the crowd, punctuated by cheers and calls for more drinks. Marcus basked in the adulation, his chest swelling with pride as he accepted congratulations from men who knew nothing about engineering but recognized success when they saw it. "Heard tell there was some old coot hanging around the work site today," called out a voice from the back of the room. Someone said he claimed to be some kind of famous bridge builder. Marcus's expression shifted to theatrical amusement. "Oh, you mean Iron Ezra," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "That's what the old fossil calls himself. Iron Ezra, like he's some kind of legend instead of just another broke down has been looking for handouts." The crowd erupted in laughter at Marcus's imitation of an elderly man's trembling voice. "Iron Ezra," he repeated in a quavering falsetto. "Iron Rusty is more like it. Probably built bridges back when they used rope and prayers instead of proper engineering." But not everyone in the saloon found Marcus's performance amusing. At a table near the window, retired railroad supervisor Jake Morrison sat nursing his whiskey with a troubled expression. Morrison had worked for 3 different railroad companies over 20 years, and he had heard the name Iron Ezra spoken with genuine respect by men who knew excellence when they saw it. Morrison's weathered face showed the concern of someone who recognized the difference between reputation and reality. He had seen enough construction projects go wrong to know that youth and confidence were poor substitutes for experience and wisdom, but the crowd's enthusiasm made any dissenting voice unwelcome. Meanwhile, outside the saloon, Ezra Thornfield walked through the darkened streets of the frontier town with the measured pace of a man who had reached a decision. The temperature had dropped with the setting sun, and his breath formed small clouds in the crisp mountain air as he made his way toward the construction site. The canyon lay empty and silent under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch in the thin atmosphere. Ezra descended the rocky slope with movements made sure-footed by decades of working in difficult terrain, his small lantern casting a circle of yellow light that revealed the path without announcing his presence to anyone who might be watching from town. The foundation framework loomed before him like a monument to misguided ambition. In the lantern light, The structural errors that daylight had revealed became even more apparent. Support beams that should have been perfectly aligned showed variances that would create dangerous stress points. Foundation anchors that should have been set to precise specifications were installed at angles that guaranteed eventual failure. Ezra set his lantern on the blueprint table and spread his own engineering drawings beside Marcus's plans. The differences were immediately apparent to anyone with the knowledge to read them. Where Marcus's crew had estimated and approximated, Ezra's calculations showed precise measurements. Where they had relied on visual alignment, his drawings specified exact angles and tolerances. Working by lantern light with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed similar corrections countless times before, Ezra began making subtle adjustments to the foundation work. He did not remove any of the existing structure, but rather reinforced the weakest points and corrected the most dangerous misalignments. A loose foundation bolt was tightened to proper torque specifications. A support beam that had been installed 3 degrees off true was adjusted to its correct angle. Cross braces that had been mounted at inconsistent heights were standardized to distribute loads evenly. Each correction was small enough to escape casual notice, but significant enough to prevent catastrophic failure. Ezra worked with the quiet concentration that had made him legendary, his movements economical and precise even after 40 years of similar challenges. By midnight, he had transformed Marcus's dangerous approximations into a structure that would actually support the loads it was designed to carry. The changes were subtle but critical, the difference between a bridge that would stand for decades and one that would collapse within months. Ezra packed his tools and drawings with the same methodical care he had shown in making the corrections. His lantern cast dancing shadows across the canyon walls as he climbed back toward town, leaving behind no evidence of his presence except a foundation that would no longer kill the men who worked on it. The next morning brought Marcus and his crew back to the work site with the same confidence they had displayed the day before. But something had changed during the night, something that none of them could immediately identify. The foundation framework looked exactly as they had left it, yet somehow it felt different. Tom Bradley was the first to notice that several bolts he remembered being loose now seemed properly tightened. Jake Morrison observed that a support beam he recalled being slightly crooked now appeared perfectly aligned. Sam Patterson mentioned that cross braces which had varied in height yesterday now seemed to match their specifications exactly. Marcus dismissed their observations as tricks of the morning light and the effects of too much celebration the night before. Real men, he declared, didn't second-guess themselves or see problems where none existed. They had important work to complete and railroad executives to impress, and no time to waste on imaginary mysteries. But as the crew began their second day of work, each man carried a small seed of doubt that had not been there the morning before. Someone had been at their construction site during the night, someone with the knowledge and skill to make corrections they hadn't even realized were necessary. High on his rocky perch, Ezra Thornfield watched the morning's activities through his telescope and allowed himself the smallest of satisfied smiles. The foundation would hold now, at least long enough for the railroad company to recognize the crew's incompetence and replace them with engineers who understood the difference between speed and safety. But Marcus Steele was not a man who accepted mysteries gracefully, and the subtle changes to his work site had planted a dangerous anger in his heart. Before the day was finished, that anger would demand an explanation, and Ezra Thornfield would find himself facing a confrontation that would test more than his engineering expertise. The old bridge builder settled back against his boulder and opened his notebook to a fresh page. The morning was young, and Marcus's crew was already making new mistakes that would require careful documentation. Experience had taught Ezra that pride always came before the fall, but he had never seen men so determined to prove the saying true as the ones working in the canyon below. Marcus arrived at the work site that morning with the focused intensity of a hunter tracking prey. The mysterious corrections to his foundation work had festered in his mind throughout the night, growing from minor irritation into genuine fury. Someone had violated his construction site, had dared to suggest that his methods were inadequate, and Marcus Steele was not a man who tolerated such disrespect. He examined every bolt, every beam, every measurement with obsessive thoroughness. The evidence was undeniable. Foundation anchors that had been loose were now properly torqued. Support beams that had been misaligned were now perfectly positioned. Cross braces that had varied in height were now standardized to exact specifications. The corrections were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew construction work. More importantly, they were technically superior to the original installation, a fact that stung Marcus's pride worse than any direct insult. Someone with greater expertise had found his work wanting and had taken it upon themselves to fix his mistakes. When his crew gathered around the blueprint table for their morning assignments, Marcus's rage was barely contained beneath a veneer of professional control. His dark eyes burned with the kind of anger that made smart men step back and foolish ones prepare for violence. "Boys," Marcus announced, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Tom Bradley's massive frame shift nervously. "We got ourselves a saboteur. Someone's been messing with our work during the night, and I intend to find out who." The crew exchanged uncertain glances. They had all noticed the subtle improvements to their foundation work, but none had considered sabotage as an explanation. The changes were clearly beneficial, making their structure stronger and more stable than before. Jake Morrison, lean and quick with nervous energy, was the first to voice the obvious question. "Boss, if someone was sabotaging our work, wouldn't they make it worse instead of better?" Marcus's face flushed red at the implied challenge to his reasoning. "That's exactly what they want us to think," he snapped. "Make a few improvements to make us doubt ourselves, then come back and do real damage when our guard's down. It's psychological warfare, boys. Classic military tactics." The explanation satisfied no one, but Marcus's volatile mood discouraged further questions. He assigned the day's tasks with sharp efficiency, driving his crew to maintain their accelerated timeline while posting Tom Bradley as a lookout to watch for intruders. High on the ridge above, Ezra Thornfield observed the morning's activities through his telescope with growing concern. Marcus's paranoia was pushing his crew to make increasingly reckless decisions, and their structural work was deteriorating rapidly under the pressure of unrealistic deadlines and inadequate supervision. Around midday, a dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of new visitors to the frontier town. A railroad company survey team had arrived ahead of schedule, led by a weathered man whose bearings suggested decades of experience in construction and engineering. Jake Morrison climbed down from the survey wagon with movements that spoke of old injuries and hard years spent in dangerous places. At 58, he carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than bluster. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, his clothes practical but well-maintained, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man who could read a construction site like others read newspapers. Morrison had worked as a railroad supervisor for over 20 years, overseeing projects from the Great Plains to the Pacific Coast. He had seen good engineers and bad ones, competent crews and disasters waiting to happen. His reputation for spotting problems before they became catastrophes had saved lives and millions of dollars in company assets. The surveyor made his way directly to the construction site, where Marcus rushed to greet him with the nervous enthusiasm of someone trying to make a perfect first impression. Morrison's experienced eye immediately cataloged the foundation work, noting both the crew's original errors and the mysterious corrections that had been made during the night. "Interesting technique," Morrison observed, kneeling beside one of the corrected foundation anchors. "This bolt was installed using the Thornfield method. Haven't seen that particular approach in 10 years. Marcus's confident smile faltered at the mention of an unfamiliar name. "Thornfield method," he repeated uncertainly. "Can't say I'm familiar with that particular technique." Morrison straightened slowly, his weathered face showing surprise. "Really? Most bridge engineers west of the Mississippi know the Thornfield innovations. Revolutionized railroad construction back in the 70s. Fellow named Ezra Thornfield developed techniques for building in impossible terrain that saved the industry millions in failed projects." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had mocked that exact name just yesterday, had dismissed Iron Ezra as the delusional fantasy of a broken-down old man. Now a railroad company supervisor was speaking of Thornfield techniques with genuine respect. "This Ezra Thornfield," Marcus said carefully. "He's still working in construction?" Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. "Haven't heard his name attached to any projects in recent years. Word was he retired after the Deadwood Canyon incident." Poor bastard predicted a bridge collapse 3 weeks before it happened, but the railroad bosses wouldn't listen. Said his methods were too old-fashioned. 73 workers died when those supports failed exactly like he said they would. The surveyor's voice carried the weight of personal memory, and Marcus realized with growing unease that Morrison had been present for the disaster he described. Iron Ezra saved my life that day, Morrison continued. Pulled me off that bridge 20 minutes before it went down. Said the harmonics were wrong, that the wind patterns would set up destructive resonance in the support cables. I thought he was being overly cautious until I watched $2 million worth of steel and timber crash into the canyon. Marcus felt his world shifting beneath his feet like unstable ground during an earthquake. The old man he had dismissed and humiliated was not some delusional drifter seeking handouts. He was a legendary engineer whose techniques were still being used by railroad companies across the country. Morrison's examination of the foundation work continued with growing interest. Whoever made these corrections knows their business, he said admiringly. Classic Thornfield precision work. Foundation anchors set to exact specifications, support beams aligned with mathematical perfection. Haven't seen craftsmanship this good since I worked with Iron Ezra himself. The implications were becoming impossible to ignore. The mysterious improvements to Marcus's foundation work had been made by someone with expertise that rivaled the legendary Ezra Thornfield himself. And there was only one man in the area who had demonstrated that level of knowledge. Morrison stood and brushed dust from his knees, his experienced eye taking in the larger scope of the construction project. Who's your chief engineer on this project? He asked. Marcus's mouth went dry as he struggled to find words. We don't have a chief engineer, he admitted. I'm the foreman, and my crew handles all the technical work. Morrison's expression shifted to concern bordering on alarm. No chief engineer, he repeated slowly. On a project this size, spanning terrain this challenging. Who approved your construction techniques? The questions were becoming increasingly uncomfortable for Marcus, who had built his career on confidence and bluster rather than technical expertise. Railroad company gave us the basic plans, he said defensively. We're following standard procedures. But Morrison's trained eye was already cataloging problems that Marcus's crew had created in their rush to meet impossible deadlines. Support beam placements that violated basic engineering principles. Cross brace angles that would create dangerous stress concentrations. Foundation depths that were insufficient for the loads they would eventually carry. Son, Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen too many preventable disasters. You're building a death trap. These support structures won't hold under the first heavy load. The words hit Marcus like a physical assault on his competence and leadership. He had staked his reputation on this project, had promised the railroad company results that would establish his crew as the premier construction team in the territory. Morrison's assessment threatened everything Marcus had worked to achieve. You're wrong, Marcus said with desperate conviction. My boys know their business. We've built bridges across 3 territories without a single failure. Morrison's weathered face showed the patience of someone who had dealt with inexperienced foremen before. Son, I've been building railroads since before you were born. I can read structural stress patterns like you read your morning newspaper. This foundation will fail catastrophically within a month of completion. The confrontation drew attention from the work crew, who gathered around their foreman with expressions of uncertainty and growing fear. They had absolute confidence in Marcus's leadership, but Morrison's credentials and obvious expertise made his warnings impossible to dismiss. Tom Bradley stepped forward with the loyal aggression of someone defending his pack leader. Mister, he said in his rumbling voice, we don't appreciate outsiders coming here and insulting our work. Maybe you should head back to wherever you came from. Morrison studied the massive redhead with the calm assessment of someone who had faced down angry workers before. I understand your loyalty to your foreman, he said diplomatically. But my concern is for your safety. These structural problems will kill people if they're not corrected. The standoff was interrupted by the arrival of townspeople who had heard about the railroad supervisor's unexpected visit. Word spread quickly through the small frontier community that an expert was examining the bridge construction, and curious citizens gathered at a respectful distance to observe the proceedings. Among the observers, Clara Henley watched with particular interest as Morrison continued his examination of the foundation work. Her sharp eyes noted the surveyor's obvious expertise and his growing concern about the construction techniques being employed by Marcus's crew. Morrison's inspection revealed problems that confirmed Ezra's earlier observations. Foundation anchors installed at incorrect angles. Support beams mounted at heights that would create uneven load distribution. Cross braces positioned to amplify rather than dampen structural vibration. But interwoven among the dangerous errors were corrections that showed masterful understanding of engineering principles. Someone with extraordinary skill had identified the most critical problems and had made subtle adjustments that would prevent immediate catastrophic failure. The quality of the corrective work impressed Morrison more than the original errors concerned him. Whoever had made these improvements possessed knowledge that few engineers in the country could match. The precision and technique were unmistakably those of a master craftsman. As the afternoon wore on, Morrison's questions became increasingly pointed. Who had access to the construction site after hours? Which crew members possessed advanced engineering training? Whether any consultants had been employed to review their technical work. Marcus's answers became increasingly evasive as he struggled to explain phenomena that challenged his authority and expertise. He could not admit that his work had required correction by someone with superior knowledge without undermining his position as foreman. The tension reached a breaking point when Morrison discovered a foundation anchor that had been reset using a technique he immediately recognized. "This is definitely Thornfield method," he announced. Whoever did this correction work learned directly from Iron Ezra himself. Clara Henley stepped forward from the crowd of observers, her voice carrying clearly in the canyon air. "There's an old fellow been watching your work from the ridge up there," she said, pointing toward Ezra's observation post. "Been taking notes all week. Name of Ezra something." Morrison's head snapped up at the name, his weathered face showing excitement and disbelief. "Ezra," he repeated. "What did this fellow look like?" Clara described Ezra's appearance in detail, noting his weathered features, silver beard, and pale blue eyes. She mentioned his obvious expertise with surveying equipment and his careful study of the construction site. Morrison absorbed the description with growing amazement. "That's him," he whispered. "That's Iron Ezra Thornfield himself. I'd recognize that description anywhere." The revelation hit the gathered crowd like lightning striking dry timber. The legendary engineer that Marcus had dismissed and humiliated was not some delusional old man seeking employment. He was one of the most respected bridge builders in the country, whose innovations had revolutionized railroad construction. Marcus felt his world collapsing as thoroughly as the bridges Iron Ezra had predicted would fail. His cruel mockery of the old man now appeared not as justified authority, but as catastrophic misjudgment. He had rejected the help of a master engineer and had insulted a legend. Morrison immediately demanded to meet with Ezra, his excitement barely contained as he contemplated the opportunity to work with his former mentor again. But when the crowd looked toward the ridge where Ezra usually maintained his observation post, they found only empty rocks and afternoon shadows. The old engineer had vanished, leaving behind only the evidence of his expertise in the corrected foundation work and the growing certainty that Marcus Steele had made the worst mistake of his professional career. As evening approached and the crowd dispersed, Marcus stood alone beside his construction site with the bitter taste of humiliation burning in his throat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncomfortable questions from railroad executives who would want explanations he could not provide. But tonight, somewhere in the darkness surrounding the canyon, Iron Ezra Thornfield was making calculations that would determine whether Marcus's bridge stood or fell, whether his crew lived or died, and whether justice would finally be served to those who confused arrogance with competence. Dawn broke gray and ominous over the canyon, thick clouds rolling in from the western peaks like harbingers of the storm that had been building for days. The morning air carried an electric tension that made horses nervous and set dogs to whimpering in the town below. But it was not weather that had the canyon on edge. It was the deadline that Marcus Steele had promised to meet, and the growing certainty that his bridge would not survive to see another sunrise. The foundation framework groaned audibly in the morning wind, timber joints straining under loads they had never been designed to carry. Support beams that should have been rock solid swayed with movements that sent shivers through every experienced construction worker who witnessed them. The bridge was dying, and everyone except Marcus could see the symptoms. Marcus arrived at the work site in a state of manic determination, his dark eyes burning with the fever of a man who would rather die than admit failure. He had spent the night poring over engineering manuals and railroad specifications, searching desperately for some technique or innovation that would salvage his reputation and his project. His crew gathered around the blueprint table with expressions of barely concealed fear. Tom Bradley's massive frame showed uncharacteristic hesitation as he studied the swaying support structure. Jake Morrison and Sam Patterson exchanged glances that spoke of shared doubt about their foreman's increasingly erratic behavior. "Boys," Marcus announced with forced enthusiasm, "today we make history. The railroad executives arrive this afternoon to inspect our completed work, and we're going to give them something they'll never forget." But the confidence in his voice was undermined by the tremor in his hands as he spread the blueprints across the scarred wooden table. Sleep deprivation and stress had carved new lines around his eyes, and his usual commanding presence had been replaced by the desperate energy of a gambler betting everything on a final hand. Tom Bradley cleared his throat nervously, his voice carrying none of its usual boisterous confidence. "Boss, those support beams don't look right. They're moving more than they should be." Marcus's response was swift and vicious. "They're fine," he snapped, "just settling into their proper positions. You boys worry too much instead of focusing on the work that needs doing." The crew fell silent, but their expressions showed the doubt that Marcus refused to acknowledge. They had followed his leadership through dozens of successful projects, but this bridge felt different. Wrong. Dangerous in ways that their limited technical knowledge could not fully articulate, but their survival instincts recognized clearly. As the morning progressed, the structural problems became impossible to ignore. Foundation anchors that had been marginally adequate when first installed were now showing signs of stress that bordered on imminent failure. Cross braces that should have provided stability were creating harmonic vibrations that made the entire framework shudder in the wind. From his observation post on the ridge, Ezra Thornfield watched the morning's developments with the grim satisfaction of someone whose predictions were proving catastrophically accurate. Through his telescope, he could see stress fractures forming in support joints, could observe the telltale deflections that indicated structural failure was measured in hours rather than days. But this morning, Ezra was not content to remain a passive observer. Beside him on the rocky ledge sat his original engineer's kit, the leather satchel that had accompanied him through 4 decades of construction projects across the western frontier. Inside were the tools of his trade: precision measuring instruments, specialized hammers, steel squares, and levels that had been crafted by master toolmakers and maintained with religious devotion. More importantly, Ezra carried with him the original engineering specifications for this exact bridge design. He had created the revolutionary support system that Marcus was attempting to build, had calculated every stress load and wind shear factor that the canyon would impose on any structure spanning its width. The Thornfield Bridge system had been his masterpiece, a breakthrough in engineering that had made transcontinental railroad construction possible. But Marcus and his crew were building a corruption of his design, a dangerous approximation that retained the appearance of his innovation while discarding the critical technical details that made it functional. Ezra rose from his observation post and began the careful descent toward the construction site, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the urgency of the situation. At 67, he no longer possessed the raw physical strength of his youth, but 4 decades of dangerous construction work had left him with skills that youth and strength could not match. His weathered hands gripped the surveying equipment with the steady confidence of someone who had used these tools to solve problems that had stymied entire engineering departments. His pale blue eyes showed the sharp focus of a master craftsman who had been forced to watch incompetent hands destroy his life's work. Marcus spotted Ezra's approach while directing his crew's increasingly frantic efforts to stabilize the swaying framework. The sight of the old man carrying professional equipment instead of seeking employment triggered a rage that had been building since the mysterious corrections had first appeared. Well, Marcus called out, his voice carrying clearly across the construction site. "Look what the wind blew in, boys. Our friendly neighborhood saboteur, come to admire his handiwork." The crew turned to watch Ezra's approach with expressions that mixed curiosity and unease. Word of Morrison's revelations about Iron Ezra had spread through the work crew, planting seeds of doubt about their treatment of the legendary engineer. But loyalty to Marcus and fear of his volatile temper kept their questions unspoken. Ezra reached the edge of the construction site and set down his equipment with movements that showed no acknowledgement of Marcus's hostility. His weathered face remained calm as he studied the failing structure, his experienced eye cataloging every dangerous flaw with professional detachment. "That framework will collapse within the hour," Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating an obvious truth. "The harmonic resonance is building toward destructive frequency, and those foundation anchors are failing under cyclic stress loads." Marcus's face flushed red at the casual dismissal of his life's work. His hands clenched into fists as he stepped closer to Ezra, using his height advantage to loom over the older man with obvious threat. "I warned you to stay away from my work site, old man," Marcus snarled. "This is your last chance to walk away before I have the boys teach you some manners about trespassing and sabotage." Tom Bradley and Jake Morrison moved to flank their foreman, their massive frames creating an intimidating wall of muscle and hostile intent. But Sam Patterson hung back, his expression troubled as he studied the swaying support beams that seemed to validate Ezra's warnings about imminent collapse. Ezra looked up at Marcus without a trace of fear or intimidation, his pale blue eyes holding the kind of steady resolve that made violent men reconsider their intentions. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with absolute certainty. "My name is Ezra Thornfield," he said with quiet dignity. "For 40 years, I have built bridges that have never fallen. I have saved more lives than you have had birthdays, boy. I designed this bridge system that you are destroying through ignorance and incompetence." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each syllable stripping away another layer of his assumed authority. The crew exchanged glances that showed growing recognition of the name and its legendary reputation in railroad construction. But Marcus was too committed to his course to retreat now, too invested in his image as an innovative leader to acknowledge that he had been wrong from the beginning. His hand moved toward the gun on his hip, a gesture that spoke of desperation rather than confidence. "I don't care if you're God Almighty himself," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "This is my construction site, my project, and my authority. You walk away right now, or we settle this the hard way." The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses and the rattle of wagon wheels on rocky ground. Jake Morrison arrived at a gallop, his weathered face showing the urgency of someone bearing critical news. Behind him rode 2 railroad company officials whose presence commanded immediate attention from everyone at the construction site. Morrison dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his experienced eye immediately taking in the dangerous state of the bridge framework. The supports were visibly unstable now, swaying with movements that spoke of imminent structural failure. "Marcus," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with construction emergencies before. "Step away from that framework right now. The whole thing is about to come down." But it was not the structural danger that had brought Morrison racing to the construction site. He carried with him a telegram that would change everything, a message from the railroad company president that elevated Ezra's status from unwanted observer to absolute authority over the project. Morrison approached the confrontation with the telegram held prominently in his weathered hand, his expression showing the satisfaction of someone who was about to deliver long overdue justice. "This just came in on the morning wire," Morrison announced, his voice carrying clearly across the construction site. "Direct from railroad company headquarters in Chicago." Message reads, "If Master Engineer Ezra Thornfield is present at Colorado Bridge construction site, he is hereby granted full authority over all structural work and safety decisions. Previous foreman assignments are suspended pending technical review. Signed, President Harrison Wheeler, Continental Railroad Company." The telegram hit Marcus like a cannonball to his professional chest. Everything he had built his reputation on, every assumption about his authority and competence, crumbled in the space of a single written message. The railroad company had not only endorsed Ezra's expertise, but had specifically stripped Marcus of his leadership role. The crew absorbed the news with expressions of shock and growing understanding. They had not simply insulted an elderly drifter seeking work. They had humiliated one of the most respected engineers in the country, a man whose innovations had made their own employment possible. Tom Bradley was the first to step back from the confrontation, his massive frame suddenly seeming small and uncertain. Jake Morrison followed, his nervous energy replaced by the stillness of someone who had just realized the magnitude of his mistake. But Marcus was beyond reason now, driven by a desperation that made retreat impossible. His hand closed around the grip of his revolver as he faced the complete destruction of everything he had worked to achieve. "I don't give a damn about your telegram," Marcus said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "This is my crew, my project, and my authority. No broken-down old has-been is going to waltz in here and take over my life's work." The gun cleared leather with the speed of someone who had practiced the movement countless times, its barrel swinging to point directly at Ezra's chest. The metallic click of the hammer being drawn back seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that gripped the construction site. But Ezra Thornfield had faced armed men before, had worked in territories where violence was a daily reality and survival depended on nerve rather than speed. He stood motionless under the gun's threat, his pale blue eyes showing no fear as he studied Marcus with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating a dangerous but ultimately manageable problem. "The supports will fail within minutes now," Ezra said calmly, his voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone he might have used to comment on the weather. "You can shoot me, boy, or you can live. But you cannot do both." As if summoned by his words, a deep, groaning sound rose from the bridge framework, the tortured cry of timber and iron being stressed beyond their breaking point. The harmonic vibrations that Ezra had predicted were building toward destructive resonance, and the entire structure was beginning to shake itself apart. Marcus's gun wavered as he heard his life's work crying out in mechanical agony. His eyes darted between Ezra's calm face and the swaying framework, caught between the need to maintain dominance and the growing certainty that the old engineer's predictions were proving devastatingly accurate. The crisis reached its breaking point when a thunderous crack echoed across the canyon, the sound of a major support beam splitting under stress that had exceeded its design limits. The framework lurched sideways with a movement that sent tools and equipment cascading toward the canyon floor. Tom Bradley let out a curse that would have made a cavalry sergeant proud as he scrambled away from the collapsing structure. Jake Morrison and Sam Patterson followed, their loyalty to Marcus instantly forgotten in the face of mortal danger. The bridge was dying exactly as Ezra had predicted, and everyone except Marcus could see that only the old engineer's expertise offered any hope of preventing a catastrophe that would destroy reputations and careers and quite possibly claim lives. Marcus stood alone with his drawn gun, facing the choice between admitting his failures or watching his world collapse as thoroughly as the bridge he had failed to build properly. The sound of splintering timber and the groans of overstressed metal provided the soundtrack for a moment of truth that would define the rest of his life. And through it all, Ezra Thornfield waited with the patience of someone who had seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times before, ready to save lives and salvage what could be salvaged from the wreckage of Marcus Steele's ambition and incompetence. The thunderous crack of splintering timber echoed across the canyon like the sound of the world breaking apart. A massive support beam, stressed beyond its capacity by Marcus's flawed construction techniques, split along its grain with a violence that sent vibrations through the entire framework. Tools and equipment that had been positioned on temporary platforms crashed toward the canyon floor in a cacophony of metal striking stone. Tom Bradley let out a string of curses that would have impressed a riverboat captain as he scrambled away from the collapsing structure. His massive frame moved with surprising speed as falling debris missed his red head by inches. Jake Morrison and Sam Patterson followed close behind, their earlier loyalty to Marcus forgotten in the face of immediate mortal danger. But Ezra Thornfield moved toward the crisis instead of away from it, his weathered hands already reaching for the specialized tools in his engineer's kit. At 67, his movements carried none of the panicked energy of the younger men, but rather the fluid precision of someone who had faced similar emergencies countless times before. Marcus stood frozen in place, his drawn revolver wavering between Ezra's approaching figure and the disintegrating bridge that represented his ruined career. The sound of his life's work tearing itself apart created a symphony of failure that drove him deeper into desperate denial. "Stay back, old man," Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with strain. "You're not touching my bridge. This is sabotage, pure and simple. You did something to weaken those supports." Ezra ignored the gun pointed at his chest, his pale blue eyes focused entirely on the structural catastrophe unfolding before him. His experienced gaze cataloged stress points and failure patterns with the clinical precision of a surgeon examining a patient in crisis. Foundation anchors were pulling loose under cyclic loading. Cross braces were amplifying harmonic vibrations instead of damping them. The entire framework was shaking itself to pieces in a cascade of engineering failures. "The harmonic frequency is building toward total resonance," Ezra said calmly, his voice carrying clearly over the groaning of overstressed timber. "We have perhaps 10 minutes before complete structural collapse." He set his surveying equipment on the blueprint table with movements that showed no acknowledgement of Marcus's threats or the mortal danger surrounding them. From his leather kit, he withdrew tools that most of the crew had never seen before. Precision measuring devices, specialized clamps, and adjustment mechanisms that had been crafted by master toolmakers decades earlier. Marcus's desperation drove him to irrational action. He rushed forward, placing himself between Ezra and the failing bridge, his gun held at chest level with shaking hands. "I said stay back," Marcus repeated, his voice rising to a near shriek. "Nobody moves until I figure out what's happening here. This is still my construction site and my authority." But Ezra had spent 40 years working in territories where armed confrontations were daily occurrences, where survival often depended on nerve rather than speed. He studied Marcus with the calm assessment of someone evaluating a dangerous but ultimately manageable obstacle. "Son," Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that came from absolute certainty. "I have built bridges in Apache territory under rifle fire. I have worked through blizzards that killed lesser men. I have constructed spans over canyons that made this one look like a creek bed. You and your gun do not frighten me." The old engineer stepped forward with movements that showed no fear, his weathered hands steady as he reached for the emergency stabilization equipment that might save the collapsing structure. Marcus pulled the trigger in panic, but his shaking hands sent the shot wide, the bullet striking stone instead of flesh. Before Marcus could cock the hammer for a second shot, Ezra's hand closed around his wrist with a grip that spoke of 40 years shaping iron and timber with manual tools. The gun fell from nerveless fingers as Marcus discovered that age had not diminished the old engineer's strength as much as appearances suggested. Ezra twisted Marcus's arm with surgical precision, applying just enough pressure to disable without permanent damage. The young foreman dropped to his knees with a gasp of pain, his earlier bluster replaced by shocked recognition of his physical helplessness. "I have shaped more iron with these hands than you have seen in your lifetime," Ezra said matter-of-factly, releasing Marcus's wrist and turning back to his emergency equipment. "Now step aside before your incompetence kills someone." Billy Cheon, the youngest member of Marcus's crew, had been watching the confrontation with growing understanding of the forces at play. Unlike his older colleagues, Billy possessed enough engineering education to recognize the signs of imminent structural failure that Ezra was describing. The harmonic vibrations, the stress concentrations, the cascade of mechanical failures all matched textbook descriptions of bridge collapses he had studied. When Ezra began implementing emergency stabilization procedures with movements that showed masterful understanding of structural engineering, Billy stepped forward to assist despite Marcus's furious protests. "What do you need me to do?" Billy asked, his voice showing the respect that Marcus had failed to earn through bluster and intimidation. Ezra glanced at the young man with approval, recognizing both intelligence and courage in someone willing to act against group pressure when lives were at stake. "Hold this tension cable while I adjust the anchor point," he instructed. "Keep steady pressure until I signal the release." Working together with the efficiency that came from competence rather than chaos, Ezra and Billy began implementing emergency corrections to the most critical failure points. Where Marcus's crew had relied on approximation and visual estimation, Ezra used precision instruments to calculate exact loads and stress distributions. The old engineer's movements showed the fluid grace of someone who had performed similar rescues dozens of times before. His weathered hands adjusted tension cables with mathematical precision, repositioned support beams to proper load-bearing angles, and implemented temporary reinforcements that stabilized the oscillating framework. Tom Bradley and Jake Morrison watched the emergency repairs with growing amazement. They had spent years following Marcus's leadership, accepting his techniques as the cutting edge of modern construction methods. But watching Ezra work was like seeing a master craftsman demonstrate skills they had never imagined possible. "The old bastard knows what he's doing," Tom said quietly, his earlier hostility replaced by grudging respect for obvious expertise. Jake Morrison nodded agreement, his nervous energy subdued by the realization that they were witnessing engineering techniques that revolutionized their understanding of bridge construction. "Look at those cable adjustments," he whispered. "I've never seen anything like that precision." Sam Patterson, the largest member of the original crew, stepped forward to offer assistance despite Marcus's increasingly frantic protests. "Boss," he said apologetically, "we got to help him save the bridge. This old fellow knows things we never learned." Marcus scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with rage and humiliation as he watched his authority evaporate like morning mist. His crew was abandoning him for an elderly stranger, choosing competence over loyalty in the face of obvious crisis. "You're all traitors," Marcus screamed, his voice carrying across the canyon with the shrill desperation of someone whose world was collapsing as thoroughly as his bridge. "He's sabotaged our work, and now you're helping him cover up his crimes." But his protests fell on deaf ears as more crew members recognized the difference between Ezra's masterful technique and their own crude approximations. The old engineer was not just stopping the structural collapse. He was improving the bridge design beyond anything they had thought possible. Ezra worked with the focused intensity of someone racing against time and physics. His pale blue eyes tracked stress patterns and load distributions with the automatic precision of decades spent solving similar problems. Each adjustment served multiple purposes. Each correction addressed several failure modes simultaneously. The emergency repairs required not just technical knowledge, but physical coordination that few men his age could have managed. Ezra moved with the sure-footed balance of someone who had spent 40 years working at dangerous heights, his weathered hands steady despite the urgency of the situation. Railroad company engineers, drawn by reports of the construction crisis, arrived to witness emergency procedures they had never seen before. Morrison led a group of technical specialists who watched Ezra's work with expressions of professional amazement. "That's the Thornfield resonance damping system," one engineer whispered to his colleague. "I've read about it in technical journals, but I never thought I'd see it implemented in person." Another specialist noted the precision cable work that was transforming harmonic amplification into structural stability. "He's not just stopping the collapse," the man observed. "He's turning the failure modes into strength multipliers." Marcus made one final desperate attempt to assert his authority over the situation. He grabbed a sledgehammer from the tool collection and raised it above his head, preparing to strike the tension cables that Ezra had so carefully adjusted. "If I can't have my bridge," Marcus shouted, "nobody gets a bridge. I'll smash this whole jury-rigged contraption before I let some husband steal credit for my work." But before the hammer could descend, Ezra moved with speed that belied his age and appeared to violate the laws of physics. His weathered hand closed around the sledgehammer's handle just inches from the critical cable, stopping Marcus's swing with the immovable resistance of granite. "Son," Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student. The boy was right about one thing. This is about more than building a bridge. This is about respecting the craft and the lives that depend on it. With surgical precision, Ezra twisted the hammer from Marcus's grip and set it aside, his movements showing the controlled strength that came from decades of manual labor in dangerous conditions. The young foreman staggered backward, his earlier confidence replaced by the helpless rage of someone whose limitations had been exposed for everyone to see. As afternoon faded toward evening, Ezra continued his emergency repairs with assistance from an increasingly large crew of volunteers. Word had spread through the frontier town that a legendary engineer was saving the bridge project, and skilled workers arrived to offer whatever help they could provide. The old engineer directed their efforts with the natural authority that came from obvious competence. His instructions were clear, specific, and designed to maximize both safety and efficiency. Men who had never met before worked together with the coordination of a precision team, united by their respect for Ezra's expertise. Clara Henley arrived as the sun began to set, carrying food and coffee for the workers who had been laboring without rest since the crisis began. She watched Ezra coordinate the emergency repairs with the satisfaction of someone whose earlier assessments had been proven correct. By nightfall, the bridge framework had been transformed from a structure on the verge of catastrophic collapse into a masterpiece of engineering stability. Ezra's emergency corrections had not simply prevented disaster, they had improved the design beyond its original specifications. Lanterns illuminated the work site as Ezra made final adjustments to his stabilization system. The framework that had been groaning and swaying in dangerous oscillations now stood solid and immovable, its harmonic frequencies dampened into perfect structural harmony. The townspeople who had gathered to witness the emergency repairs watched in amazement as the old engineer completed corrections that seemed to violate everything they thought they knew about construction techniques. Bridge building had become a form of technical artistry in Ezra's weathered hands. Marcus Steele stood alone at the edge of the work site, his earlier authority forgotten as thoroughly as yesterday's weather. His crew had defected to follow competent leadership, his reputation lay in ruins, and his bridge had been saved by the man he had insulted and dismissed. As the night wore on and Ezra's legendary skills continued to transform structural disaster into engineering triumph, even Marcus began to understand that he was witnessing something far beyond ordinary construction work. He was watching a master craftsman demonstrate techniques that would be studied and discussed for generations to come. The bridge was no longer Marcus's project. It belonged to Ezra Thornfield now, and everyone present understood that they were privileged to witness the return of a legend who had never truly retired, only waited for the moment when his skills were desperately needed once again. Dawn broke clear and bright over the canyon, painting the completed bridge framework in shades of gold and amber that seemed to celebrate the triumph of engineering over chaos. The structure that had been moments from catastrophic collapse 12 hours earlier now stood as a monument to precision and expertise, its every beam and cable positioned with mathematical perfection. Ezra Thornfield stood at the edge of the work site, his weathered hands resting on the surveying equipment that had guided the night's emergency repairs. His pale blue eyes showed the quiet satisfaction of someone who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through skill rather than luck. The bridge was not merely saved, it was improved beyond anything the railroad company had dared to hope for. Railroad company executives arrived with the morning sun, their expressions shifting from skepticism to amazement as they examined the structural masterpiece that had emerged from the previous day's crisis. President Harrison Wheeler himself had traveled from Chicago to inspect the project, bringing with him a team of engineering specialists who possessed enough technical knowledge to recognize revolutionary innovation when they encountered it. Wheeler walked the length of the framework with careful steps, his experienced eye cataloging improvements that exceeded every specification in the original construction contract. Cross braces that had been positioned to amplify structural vibrations had been reconfigured to dampen them. Foundation anchors that had been inadequately secured now distributed loads with perfect efficiency. The entire support system showed refinements that transformed good engineering into legendary craftsmanship. "This is remarkable work," Wheeler announced to his technical team. "The structural modifications go beyond repair into genuine innovation. Whoever supervised these corrections has revolutionized our understanding of bridge construction in mountainous terrain." Marcus Steele emerged from the crowd of observers with desperate determination written across his haggard features. He had spent the night rehearsing explanations that might salvage his reputation, crafting stories that would allow him to claim credit for the engineering miracle that Ezra had accomplished. "Mr. Wheeler," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the forced confidence of someone betting everything on a final deception. "I'm pleased to report that my crew has successfully completed the emergency repairs using advanced techniques we've been developing for challenging terrain projects. Wheeler turned to study Marcus with the sharp assessment of someone who had built a railroad empire through the ability to distinguish competence from bluster. He noted the young foreman's bloodshot eyes, his wrinkled clothes, and the nervous energy that spoke of desperation rather than pride in accomplishment. "Your crew," Wheeler repeated slowly. "And you personally supervised these structural modifications throughout the night?" Marcus nodded vigorously, his lies gaining momentum as he sensed an opportunity to redirect credit for Ezra's work. "Absolutely, sir. The resonance damping system and harmonic stabilization techniques are innovations my team has been perfecting for months. Last night's crisis gave us the perfect opportunity to demonstrate their effectiveness." But before Wheeler could respond, Billy Chin stepped forward from the group of workers who had assisted in the emergency repairs. His young face showed the courage of someone willing to speak truth regardless of consequences. "That's not accurate, sir," Billy said clearly. "The repairs were designed and supervised by Ezra Thornfield. Marcus had nothing to do with the stabilization work except trying to prevent it with threats of violence." Tom Bradley and Sam Patterson moved to flank Billy, their massive frames providing physical support for his testimony. The red-headed giant nodded agreement, his voice carrying across the work site with unmistakable conviction. "The old fellow saved this bridge and probably saved our lives," Tom declared. Marcus was fixing to smash the repair work with a sledgehammer when Mr. Thornfield stopped him. Sam Patterson added his own witness account, describing Ezra's masterful coordination of the emergency repairs and Marcus's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain authority through intimidation rather than expertise. Wheeler absorbed the testimony with the calm attention of someone who had learned to value honest workers over smooth-talking supervisors. His gaze shifted to Ezra, who had remained silent during Marcus's attempts at credit theft, focusing instead on final adjustments to the stabilization system. "Mr. Thornfield," Wheeler called out, his voice carrying the respect that Marcus had failed to earn. "I believe we need to have a conversation about your role in this project." Ezra set down his tools and approached the railroad president with the unhurried dignity that had characterized all his actions since arriving at the construction site. His weathered face showed no triumph or vindication, only the quiet professionalism of someone who had done necessary work regardless of recognition or reward. Wheeler extended his hand in greeting, a gesture of respect that was noted by every worker present. "Mr. Thornfield, I want to personally thank you for saving this project. Your innovations have created the most advanced bridge design I've ever witnessed." The railroad president's technical team surrounded Ezra with questions about his emergency procedures, their professional excitement barely contained as they recognized techniques that would revolutionize industry standards. The resonance damping system alone represented a breakthrough that could prevent bridge failures across the entire Continental Railroad network. "Mr. Thornfield," Wheeler continued, his tone becoming formal and businesslike, "I would like to offer you the position of chief engineer for our Western expansion projects. The salary would be substantial, and you would have complete authority over all technical decisions." Ezra considered the offer with the same careful deliberation he had shown in designing bridge corrections. The opportunity represented everything that Marcus had dreamed of achieving, recognition and authority on a scale that few engineers ever experienced. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Wheeler," Ezra replied finally. "But I'm too old for company politics and too set in my ways for office work. What I can offer is consultation on projects that present unusual technical challenges." Wheeler nodded understanding, recognizing in Ezra's response the independence that had made him legendary in the first place. "Very well. We'll establish you as consultant emeritus with the authority to review and approve any project you choose to examine." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of territorial law enforcement officers who had been summoned to investigate reports of workplace violence and project sabotage. Marcus's earlier threats with firearms and attempts to destroy emergency repairs had created legal consequences that extended beyond mere employment termination. As Marcus was led away under guard, his crew watched with expressions that mixed relief and embarrassment. They had followed his leadership into professional disgrace, but Ezra's intervention had saved them from the catastrophic consequences of structural collapse. 3 months later, the bridge stood completed as a testament to engineering excellence that attracted technical visitors from across the country. The The railroad company had officially renamed it Thornfield Crossing in honor of the man whose expertise had transformed potential disaster into revolutionary achievement. Ezra had established his consulting practice in the frontier town, working only on projects that presented challenges worthy of his legendary skills. Billy Chun had become his primary apprentice, learning traditional bridge-building techniques that combined old-world craftsmanship with cutting-edge innovation. The young engineer showed remarkable aptitude for the precise calculations and methodical approaches that had made Ezra famous. Under careful mentorship, Billy was developing skills that would make him one of the most sought-after bridge designers of the next generation. 6 months after the crisis, engineering journals across the country published detailed analyses of the Thornfield resonance damping system and its applications to railroad construction in challenging terrain. Universities began teaching courses based on Ezra's innovations, ensuring that his techniques would be preserved and refined by future generations. The local newspaper featured a comprehensive story about the legendary engineer who had been dismissed as too old for modern construction work, only to prove that true competence transcended age and fashion. The article described his career spanning 4 decades in 40 states, building structures that had never failed despite challenges that had defeated younger and supposedly more innovative engineers. 1 year later, the Continental Railroad Company had adopted Ezra's emergency stabilization techniques as standard practice across their entire construction network. The methods that had been dismissed as old-fashioned were now recognized as cutting-edge innovations that prevented costly failures and saved countless lives. Marcus Steele had been blacklisted from railroad construction throughout the Western Territories, his reputation destroyed by the combination of technical incompetence and violent threats against legitimate authority. He had found work as a common laborer on projects that required strength rather than expertise, his dreams of engineering leadership reduced to memories of what might have been. A bronze plaque installed at Thornfield Crossing told the story of the master craftsman who had refused employment but had completed the impossible job anyway. Travelers crossing the bridge could read about Ezra's 40-year career and his revolutionary contributions to railroad engineering, ensuring that his legacy would inspire future generations of builders. Ezra continued his consulting work with the selective approach that had characterized his entire career. He accepted only projects that challenged his expertise, preferring difficult problems that allowed him to demonstrate techniques that other engineers considered impossible. His reputation had grown beyond the technical community into legend, stories of Iron Ezra spreading through frontier towns wherever railroad construction created challenges that conventional methods could not solve. Young engineers sought him out for training, hoping to learn secrets that could transform their careers and capabilities. The frontier town prospered as word spread that the legendary bridge builder had chosen their community as his base of operations. Railroad executives and engineering students made pilgrimages to study his work and seek his advice, bringing economic opportunities that transformed the settlement into a thriving center of technical innovation. Clara Henley expanded her boarding house to accommodate the steady stream of visitors who came to learn from Ezra or simply to witness the bridge that had made him famous once again. Her kitchen became an informal meeting place where engineers from around the country gathered to discuss technical challenges and share stories of remarkable construction projects. On quiet evenings, Ezra could be found on his familiar observation post above the canyon, watching trains cross the bridge he had saved and improved. His weathered face showed the satisfaction of someone whose life's work had created lasting value, whose skills had prevented tragedy and enabled progress. 2 years after the crisis, a telegram arrived requesting Ezra's immediate consultation on an impossible construction project in the Colorado Rockies. A new railroad line required a bridge across a canyon that had defeated 3 different engineering teams, and only the legendary Iron Ezra was considered capable of solving the technical challenges involved. The young crew that arrived to escort Ezra to the new project site showed the kind of respect that Marcus had been too arrogant to display. Their foreman approached with genuine humility, asking whether the master engineer would be willing to review their preliminary plans and provide guidance on structural techniques. "We've heard stories about your work here at Thornfield Crossing," the foreman said respectfully. "If you're available, we'd be honored to have your expertise on our project." We know better than to start construction on challenging terrain without consulting someone who understands what we're attempting. Ezra studied the young men with approval, recognizing in their approach the kind of professional respect that made successful collaboration possible. Their willingness to seek expert guidance showed wisdom that exceeded their years and promised that the next generation of engineers would value competence over pride. As preparations began for the journey to the new construction site, the townspeople gathered to wish Ezra well and express their gratitude for the prosperity his presence had brought to their community. The bridge had become more than transportation infrastructure. It was a symbol of what could be accomplished when genuine expertise was recognized and respected. Billy Chun would accompany his mentor to the new project, ready to apply the skills he had learned under Ezra's patient instruction. The young engineer had progressed from apprentice to collaborator, capable of implementing advanced techniques while continuing to refine his understanding of traditional craftsmanship. The stagecoach that would carry them to their destination arrived with the kind of sturdy construction that spoke of long journeys through difficult country. Ezra loaded his engineer's kit with the same methodical care he had shown 40 years earlier when first setting out to build bridges across the western frontier. Clara Henley provided food for the journey, her practical kindness ensuring that the travelers would be well fed during their passage through mountain terrain. Her farewell carried the warmth of someone who had witnessed a legend at work and understood the privilege of that experience. As the stagecoach pulled away from Thornfield Crossing, Ezra looked back at the bridge that had restored his reputation and proven that true masters never really retired. They simply waited for the moment when their skills were desperately needed, when competence and experience could triumph over arrogance and incompetence. The bridge would stand for generations, carrying trains across the canyon with the stability that only genuine engineering excellence could provide. Future travelers would cross it without knowing the story of its salvation, but the bronze plaque would ensure that Ezra Thornfield's legacy endured as long as the structure itself. In the distance, a new challenge waited in the Colorado Rockies, another impossible project that would require the kind of expertise that few men possessed. But Iron Ezra was ready for whatever technical puzzles awaited, his weathered hands steady on the tools that had shaped the western frontier and his pale blue eyes already calculating solutions to problems that existed only in engineering nightmares. The legend continued, carried forward by a master craftsman who had proven that competence and wisdom could overcome any obstacle, whether technical or human, and that true excellence created legacies that inspired others to reach beyond their limitations toward achievements they had never thought possible. If you enjoyed this tale of a master craftsman proving his worth, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of legendary skill triumphing over arrogance. We bring you tales of competence, respect, and the power of experience every week. Until next time, remember that true masters never really retire. They just wait for the right moment to build something extraordinary.